The dust of the high plains was a lonely god, and Ilara was its sole parishioner. Her world was circumscribed by the sagging wire of her fences and the vast, indifferent blue of the sky. For 5 years since her father's grave had settled, she had spoken more to the cattle than to people, their lowing a more honest language than the whispers that followed her through the single dusty street of Prairie Ridge. They called her the spinster, the cowgirl who'd inherited nothing but debt and a stubborn streak as wide as the horizon. She was an inconvenience, a woman doing a man's work and succeeding just enough to be resented for it. The men of the town, men like Jedediah Stone, with his mean little eyes and land-hungry smirk, saw her not as a peer, but as a problem to be solved, or better yet, a joke to be told. The joke began in the saloon, over warm beer and stale laughter. It was Jed's idea, of course. That Ilara, he'd slurred, she's so desperate for a man, I reckon she'd take anything. Let's find her 1 inch. The joke grew legs, crawling through the town's bitter heart. They wouldn't find her a suitor, they'd sell her one. A cruel punchline to the long, unfunny story of her solitude. They found their man in a town 2 days east, a blacksmith's son named Thomas, whose shame was as great as his size. They called him heavy, slow, a walking monument to ridicule. They offered him a pittance, spun a lie about a work contract, and loaded him onto a wagon like livestock, the laughter of the men who'd sold him echoing long after they were gone. For Ilara, the day began as any other, with the ache in her back and the taste of grit in her mouth. She didn't know that cruelty was rattling its way down her long, unpaved drive. She didn't know the town had finally found a way to deliver its verdict right to her doorstep. The wagon creaked to a halt in her yard, raising a plume of ochre dust that settled on everything like a shroud. Jedediah Stone sat atop the driver's seat, a grin splitting his face. Behind him, in the bed of the wagon, sat a man. He was large, his shoulders slumped not from weariness but from a weight far heavier than flesh. A rough burlap sign was tied around his neck with twine. Groom, it read in crude, mocking letters. The men with Jed cackled, a harsh, ugly sound that startled the chickens. Ilara felt a cold dread snake up her spine. She saw the man's face, his eyes fixed on the splintered floorboards of the wagon, his cheeks flushed with a humiliation so profound it was almost a physical force. This was their joke. This was the culmination of all their sneers and whispers. They hadn't just brought a man, they had brought a monument to her perceived desperation, a living effigy of her loneliness. "Well, Ilara," Jed called out, his voice dripping with false magnanimity. "Heard you were in the market. We all chipped in. Cost us $2. You can have him for $1. A bargain." The man, Thomas, did not look up. He seemed to be trying to shrink, to disappear into the very wood he sat upon. Ilara's first instinct was a hot, blinding rage. She wanted to unleash the years of pent-up fury, to drive them from her land with the sharp end of a pitchfork. But then her eyes met the bowed head of the man in the wagon. She saw not the joke, but the victim. She saw a soul as cornered by the world as her own. Her anger cooled, solidifying into a hard, clear resolve. She walked back into her small, weathered house, her footsteps unnervingly steady. She returned with a single, worn silver dollar and dropped it into Jed's outstretched hand. "He's bought," she said, her voice flat and cold as a river stone. "Now get off my land." Jed and his cronies, momentarily stunned by her lack of hysteria, finally rode off, their laughter trailing behind them, thinner and less certain than before. Ilara was left in the settling dust with the man named Thomas. He finally raised his head, and his eyes, when they met hers, were filled with a bottomless well of shame. He expected her to yell, to curse him, to drive him away. He had been a prop in her humiliation, and he was braced for the fallout. He slowly, painfully, climbed down from the wagon, his large body moving with a defeated grace. He stood before her, waiting for his sentence. Ilara looked at him, truly looked at him, past the sign, past the cruel context. She saw hands that were clean and carefully kept, despite their size. She saw a kindness in the slump of his shoulders, a gentleness that the world had mistaken for weakness. "The barn," she said, her voice rough from disuse. She pointed toward the leaning structure at the edge of the yard. "The loft is dry. You can sleep there. It was not an offer of marriage, or even of welcome. It was an offer of sanctuary, as stark and unadorned as the landscape around them. Thomas simply nodded, a single, grateful dip of his head. He didn't ask for food or water. He turned and walked to the barn, his back a testament to a lifetime of absorbing insults without complaint. Inside the musty dark, the air thick with the scent of hay and decay, he saw a broken stall door hanging by a single hinge. Without a thought, without being asked, he found a few loose nails and a rock for a hammer and began to fix it. In the house, Ilara sat at her small kitchen table, the silence pressing in on her. For the first time in 5 years, it was not an empty silence. It was a shared silence, occupied by the quiet, rhythmic tapping coming from her barn. Days bled into weeks, measured not by conversation but by the slow, steady rhythm of shared labor. Words were a currency they couldn't afford, their transactions were made in deeds. Thomas rose before the sun, his large frame a silent shadow moving across the yard. He didn't wait for instruction. He saw what was broken and made it whole. The fence that had listed to one side for a year now stood straight and taut, its wire humming in the wind. He reshingled a patch on the northern face of the barn roof that had leaked every spring, his movements on the ladder surprisingly deft. He sharpened her axe until it could split a log with a single, clean stroke. He asked for nothing, and Ilara offered little in words. Her offering came on a tin plate, left on the top step of the porch every evening as dusk painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft rose. A portion of her simple meal, stew, or beans with salt pork, and a thick slice of bread. She'd watch from her window as he'd come to the porch, take the plate, and retreat to the barn to eat alone. One afternoon, she found the shirt he'd been wearing, torn at the shoulder, hanging neatly on a nail outside the barn door. He had washed it in a horse trough and hung it to dry. That night, under the soft glow of her kerosene lamp, Ilara took out her mother's sewing kit. Her stitches were small and even, a line of careful thread closing the wound in the fabric. She left the mended shirt folded in the same spot she left his dinner plate. The next day, he wore it. It was a conversation held in thread and tin, a language of mutual respect growing in the barren soil of their solitude. They were two solitary planets who had fallen into a strange, silent orbit, each held in place by the quiet gravity of the other's presence. The world outside her fences ceased to matter. The town of Prairie Ridge could have been 1,000 miles away. Her world was the smell of baking bread and sawdust, the sight of a neatly stacked woodpile growing taller than she could ever need, the sound of a hammer echoing in the afternoon sun. Then, the sky turned. Clouds the color of slate boiled up from the west, and a wind that carried the teeth of winter began to howl across the plains. It was a storm of biblical fury, the kind that reminded a person of their own fragility. Rain came down in blinding sheets, and the wind shrieked, clawing at the little house, rattling its window panes like a trapped spirit. Ilara sat inside, the lamplight flickering, her hands clenched in her lap. Storms always brought back the memory of the night her mother had passed, the wind sounding then, as it did now, like the world itself was grieving. Suddenly, the kitchen door opened, and Thomas was there, dripping water onto her floorboards. He didn't speak. He simply moved through the small house, his presence immense and calming. He checked the latch on the front door, wedging a small piece of wood into the frame to stop its violent rattling. He secured the shutters on the east window that had begun to slam against the house. His work done, he didn't retreat to the barn. He took a seat on the old crate by the hearth, a respectful distance away, and simply sat with her in the roaring dark. They weathered the storm together, two silent sentinels in a fragile fortress. The wind and rain were an external chaos that only highlighted the strange peace that had taken root within the four walls of the house. When the dawn broke, quiet and clean, the world washed new, Ilara lit the stove. As the smell of coffee filled the room, she looked over at him. "The coffee's hot," she said. It was the first invitation he had received, and as he stepped into her kitchen, the barn no longer felt like his home. The invitation to the kitchen became a morning ritual. They would sit across the small wooden table, steam from their coffee mugs rising between them, and in the quiet moments of the early dawn, pieces of their lives began to surface like stones in a receding river. She told him about her father, a man who loved the land but was a terrible businessman, and her mother, who could make wildflowers grow in the rockiest soil. "This ranch," she said one morning, her gaze fixed on the worn grain of the tabletop, "it's all I have left of them." The debt came with it, but so did their memory. Her voice was steady, a statement of fact, not a plea for pity. He listened, his gaze direct and understanding. A few days later, he spoke of his own father, a blacksmith whose pride was in his own powerful physique and the ringing sound of his hammer. "He was ashamed of me," Thomas said, his voice a low rumble. "Said I was too soft. Too slow. He said my hands were made for the delicate work of shaping hot metal, not for the hard work of being a man." He looked down at his own large hands, resting on the table. They were hands that could crush or create, and he had only ever been taught to be ashamed of their potential. "He wanted me to have a fist the world would respect. But I never learned how to make 1 inch." Elara looked at his hands, then at his face. She saw no weakness. She saw a strength that had been mislabeled his entire life, a quiet fortitude that didn't need to be announced with noise and violence. In his admission of shame, she saw an incredible honor. He was not a fighter because he was a builder. He was not aggressive because he was kind. And in that moment, the last of the transactional feeling between them dissolved. He was no longer the man who worked for his keep, he was Thomas. And she was Elara. And they were, for the first time, friends. The piece they had built was a fragile bubble in a world full of sharp edges. The sharpest of those edges was Jedediah Stone. He rode out to Elara's ranch one afternoon, a cloud of self-satisfied curiosity moving with him. He had come to gloat, to witness the failure of his grand joke. He expected to see Elara more haggard than ever, the large man gone or wallowing in filth. Instead, what he saw made his sneer falter. The fences were taut. The yard was clear of debris. A small patch of his mother's wildflowers was blooming by the porch steps, carefully tended. And there, by the barn, were Elara and Thomas, working together to reshoe her horse, moving in a comfortable, practiced rhythm. Thomas looked different. He stood taller. The shame had receded from his eyes, replaced by a quiet confidence. He was clean, and the mended shirt he wore fit his broad shoulders well. Jed's surprise curdled into a venomous anger. The joke had turned on him. They had taken his cruelty and built something decent from its wreckage. Well, he drawled, swinging down from his horse. "Looks like my prize hog is fattening up nicely on your scraps." Elara. Thomas went still, the hoof-pick frozen in his hand. Elara straightened up, her face a mask of cold fury. "You're not welcome here, Jed," she said. Jed ignored her, his eyes fixed on Thomas. "I came to see how my groom was working out." "Looks like you've made a regular pet out of him." Thomas did not rise to the bait. He did not flinch. He simply placed the horse's hoof down gently and turned to face Jed. He said nothing. He just watched him, and in his eyes was a light Jed had never seen before, not fear, not shame, but the steady, protective gaze of a man guarding his territory. Jed returned 3 nights later, as cowards do, with the cover of darkness and the courage of whiskey. He brought 2 of his cronies, their laughter loud and ugly in the quiet night air. They were not here to trade insults this time. They carried the palpable threat of violence, their intent to tear down the small sanctuary Elara and Thomas had built. They kicked over the neatly stacked woodpile, sending logs scattering across the yard. "We're here to collect the rent on your little pet project, Elara," Jed bellowed, rattling the front door. Elara appeared in the doorway, a shotgun held loosely but purposefully in her hands. "Get out," she commanded, her voice trembling but firm. Jed just laughed. "Or what? You'll shoot us." He took a step forward, shoving one of his men towards the door. "Let's go inside and see how cozy they are." But as the man lunged for the doorway, a large shape materialized behind Elara, filling the frame completely. It was Thomas. He moved with a speed that belied his size, placing his body squarely between Elara and the intruders. He was a wall of solid flesh and bone. "Leave," he said. The word was not a shout. It was a low, resonant command, as deep and immovable as the earth itself. Jed, emboldened by the whiskey, shoved him hard. "Get out of the way, you fat ox!" Thomas didn't budge. He absorbed the impact as if he were a great stone, his feet planted in the foundation of the house itself. "I said," he repeated, his voice dropping even lower, more dangerous in its quiet intensity. "Leave." He raised his hands, not in fists, but open-palmed, pushing Jed and his men back from the threshold. It wasn't a fight. It was a removal. His sheer, unmovable presence, a strength born not of rage but of pure, profound protection, was more intimidating than any weapon. Defeated by a power they could not comprehend, they stumbled back, muttering curses, and faded into the darkness from which they came. The silence they left behind was vast and ringing. The adrenaline drained away, leaving Elara trembling, the shotgun suddenly heavy in her arms. She looked at Thomas, standing like a guardian in the doorway. A trickle of blood ran from a scrape on his cheek where one of Jed's rings had caught him. His knuckles were raw from where he'd braced them against the doorframe. Without a word, she led him inside and gently pushed him into a chair at the kitchen table. She brought a bowl of warm water and a clean cloth, her hands moving with a tenderness that felt as new and fragile as the dawn. She dabbed at the cut on his cheek, her touch feather-light. The air was thick with everything they had never said, with the terror of the attack and the immense relief of its aftermath. He had shielded her. He had taken the ugliness of the world and stood in its way, protecting not just her body, but her home, their home. "They sold you to me as a joke," she whispered, her voice breaking on the last word. Her eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of a deep, aching gratitude that had no name. "A cruel, stupid joke. But you—" She had to stop, to draw a breath. "You are the kindest, strongest man I have ever known." He looked up at her then, and the light from the lamp caught the sincerity in his eyes. All the shame he had carried his entire life was gone, burned away in the crucible of that confrontation. It was replaced by a devotion so pure and absolute it made her own heart ache. "They didn't sell me to you, Elara," he said, his voice rough with emotion. He reached out and gently took the cloth from her hand, his large fingers closing over hers. "They led me home." Years passed like seasons, each one richer than the last. The ranch thrived. The fences stood strong, enclosing fields that were green and lush. The small house was no longer small, a new room and a wide porch had been added, the wood still smelling faintly of pine and of Thomas's patient labor. The sound of children's laughter now echoed in the yard, a boy with his father's gentle eyes and a girl with her mother's fierce spirit. They were the melody that had filled the silence. Elara and Thomas would often stand on that porch in the evenings, watching the sun bleed across the horizon. His arm would be around her, a familiar and comforting weight, their worn, calloused hands clasped together. They rarely needed to speak of the past. It lived not as a scar but as a foundation stone, the ugly bedrock upon which they had built something beautiful. They had taken the world's ugliest joke and turned it into a lifetime of quiet joy. They proved that a person's worth is not measured by the cruel judgment of a crowd, but by the private fortress of a loving heart. The world had tried to define them by their perceived flaws, her stubborn solitude, his gentle sighs. But together they had created their own definitions. He was not the too fat groom, he was a husband, a father, a builder of homes and of dreams. She was not the lonely cowgirl, she was a wife, a mother, the fierce guardian of their world. They had looked at what the world had discarded and seen its true value. In doing so, they hadn't just saved a ranch. They had saved each other.